this meeting will be divided in two parts. The first part, we are going to introduce you to the new migration data inventory that has been created in the framework of the QuantMig project. And in the second part of this meeting, we're going to have a very nice discussion about the state of affairs on migration data in Europe. So I don't, this is all, the first message I have to give you is that we are going to use only the Q&A function for questions. So feel free from the beginning to write down your questions, and then we'll go back to them at the end of the session after the panel debate. That's it. I'll give the floor to my colleague, Mathias Czaika. He is the head of the department and professor in migration and globalization at the Danube University in Krems in Austria. And he's also a team member of QuantMig project. So the floor is yours, Mathias.
Thank you very much, Daniela. I would like to share my screen. Can I do that? Excellent. So hopefully you can see my slides. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to present this QuantMig migration data inventory, which is one of the first sort of deliverables of this 3 years project funded by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020 research program, led by the University of Southampton and in person of Jakub Bishop. We are basically the team that has been working on this migration data inventory. It is my colleagues from Danube University in person of Akira Soto Nishimura, and from NIDI in person of Jarl Mooyaart and Helga de Wolk. So we present this joint work today at the migration data inventory as sort of the first major output of this project. So let me start with saying a few words about the QuantMig project as such. The aim of the project is to produce comprehensive and multi-perspective quantitative migration scenarios. So it's a forward-looking project. It is interested in the future of migration. And to do that, obviously, we work on conceptualizing migration, so working on theorization and theory building, but also on migration modeling, and obviously then in the end also estimating migration outcomes in terms of migration flows for the future, in terms of simulations and forecasts. A major input in this process obviously is data, and for that reason we have started, in one of the work packages in putting together this metadata base that is actually collecting, not original data, but really collecting secondary data that is out there. So why, you may ask, why another metadata inventory, why another metadatabase? Obviously, I think we all realize and perceive an increasing demand for for more data, for better data, in order to improve the evidence base, in particular on when it comes to policy making, but also when it comes to understanding and the knowledge base of historic and contemporary migration situation. The Global Compact for Migration is also obviously claiming and asking for better data, migration data, better statistics, etc. So we also respond in a way to this call. For historic and contemporary, and in particular what this project is aiming for predicting migration or forecasting migration, obviously good migration data, not just any migration data, but good migration data is a key input. So what is good migration data? First of all, obviously, good migration needs to exist. So it has to be collected. It has to be out there. Then data also has to be accurate, mostly error-free. It has to measure what it's meant to measure. It has to be reliable and consistent over time. Ideally, comprehensive in terms of, relative minimal number of missings and gaps in the data set. It has to be comparable. So in particular, when we do cross-comparative analysis, obviously it's usually important that countries, statistical offices, etc., use the same or relatively similar definitions when it comes to particular data sets. And of course, good data is purposeful, it's meaningful, it's useful for further analysis in order to address questions of policymakers, but also obviously questions to be addressed with regard to knowledge gaps. So question, is good migration data all that we need? Obviously not. It's just one important ingredient to improve the evidence base. What we need is good theory, is good models, and good data. So good data is necessary, but obviously not a sufficient condition. But all three elements basically is part of the QuantMig project. So we work on theory, we work on models, and on data. Today we focus here on data explicitly. So the objective of the migration data inventory, which is, by the way, online already, has recently released, and my colleague Jarl Mooyaart will introduce you in a minute on how to use that inventory and say more about the features of this data inventory. The key objectives of the data inventory is to give and to provide a structured overview of the migration stocks and flow data that is out there. We know that there is, an increasing number of data sets that is collected. There's an increasing data density, if you like. So an increasing number of data sets that is out there, and it's easy to lose oversight and overview in all of this. So we aim with this data inventory to create a user-friendly way to get an overview of what kind of data is out there, but not just by putting all these data sets on a website and say here it is, but we provide additional information on each data set. We assess the quality of these data sets in terms of the comprehensiveness, the accuracy, the timeliness, etc. So in order to make to provide users tools to make an informed decision when users, so researchers and policymakers and general public alike, may make a decision on which data sets actually to use for their needs and for their analyses. So what these quality criteria are and what the data inventory as such looks like, this will be explained by my colleague Jarl Mooyaart. I pass on to him, who will introduce you to another level of detail. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. I indeed will tell you a bit more about the QuantMig migration data inventory itself. To give a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about, I will first talk about the selection criteria we used, then our search criteria, our search strategy, then what characteristics of the data sets that we show. I'll talk a little bit about the quality assessment that we added. Then I'll give you a quick demonstration of the website, and then I'll close with sort of some future ideas. So which data sets did we include? First of all, this data inventory is really focused on EU migration. So we included data sets that cover migration to and within the EU. Also, data sets need to be cross-national in that they need to cover at least 2 EU countries. Another criterion is that, of course, it needs to be either stock or flow migration data, so quantitative data, in which we do also include somewhat smaller scale surveys that, for instance, conducted by academic researchers. The data also needs to be on the country level. If it also contains information on the regional level, that's a bonus, but it needs to at least be on the country level. The data should be not older than like before 2000, meaning that at least the latest wave needs to be after the year 2000. Preferably the data needs to be accessible, open access, or either that you know where you can apply for the data. This is not always the case, but we always try to indicate where you can get the data. This data inventory does not include what has been more recently used, like digital trace or social media data. Yeah, this is really another type of data, and also it's not always easy to get this type of data. Another thing we came across in compiling this data inventory is what is a data set? And that may sound very obvious, but many of these big data providers provide actually data tables. So here we had to make a choice. Is this a data set or not? And we decided to treat each of these data tables, so to say, as a unique data set. Only if some tables were clearly a subset of another table, then we didn't distinguish them as a unique data set. So our search strategy, as Mathias mentioned, there's definitely other metadatabases out there. So yes, we use that in our advantage, so to say, and we use these metadatabases to search relevant data sets for our data inventory. So yeah, here a list of many of these different metadatabases. Of course, we also use these big data providers themselves, Eurostat, OECD, World Bank, etc., and look through their website to see which are sort of their unique data sets. Apart from that, we also checked EU-funded projects to see if they had created their own data sets, and would be useful to add. And finally, we consulted experts to see if there were still any data sets missing. So what we wanted to show is, for all these data sets, is sort of like a set of key characteristics that users can see, is this data set useful or not, instead of just only listing the data sets and people then having to find out themselves everything on their own. So here, sort of an overview of the characteristics that we show, starting, of course, with the name of the data set, its provider, and where the data comes from. So, for instance, Eurostat is a provider, and they get their data from the national statistical offices. Sometimes, of course, the provider and the source are the same. Then we show the basic data characteristics. So what is the type of data that is used by the data set? So register, census, survey, or combination of these. Then what is the design of the data? Is it cross-sectional? Is it longitudinal, etc.? Is it stock or flow data? And is it micro or macro? Then we show some what we call migrant characteristics and definitions. So first, whether the data contains information on the citizenship of the migrant, country of birth, or the previous or next residence. Then whether the data distinguishes or focuses on a specific migrant type. So labor, refugee, student, etc., these different types. And then we show the details on the migration definition. We show if available, in the, what is said in the documentation, how they define migrant, and also if available, if they use a specific time definition. Then we also have some characteristics on the coverage, both geographical and temporal. So what origin and destination countries does the data set cover? the aggregation level. So all data sets have at least on the country level, but some also have information on the regional level. And then whether the data sets also cover flows within the EU. Then the years for which data has been collected in a data set, and then whether that data set is still being updated or not. Finally, we show whether the data set has information on or can be disaggregated by demographic characteristics. So this is sex, age, education, and labor or occupational status. So then about this quality assessment that we added. So the aim of this quality assessment is to provide users an overview of what are sort of the relative strengths and weaknesses of the data. So what I clearly want to state is that this is not a ranking of the data set. It's not saying sort of like, this is the best and this is the worst. Rather, we distinguish different dimensions in which data sets are either relatively good or score relatively less well. Also, we have to acknowledge that it's a difficult task to compare different types of data. It's difficult to compare, say, register data to survey data. And so in one of our dimensions, we also account for that. But basically, the key message here is that users can decide what matters more for them, but we just sort of give them different dimensions to see, to show the relative strengths and weaknesses of the different data sets. So what different dimensions do we cover? So first, geographic coverage. So how many origin destination countries does the data set cover? Then migrant characteristics. So how many sort of indicators of migrant characteristics does the data set have? So in terms of citizenship or previous next residence or country of birth. Then whether the data set distinguishes types of migrants or focuses on a specific type of migrant or does not specify. Then the completeness. So for registers, this is really looking at sort of origin destination combinations and see how much missings there are in these cells. Whereas for surveys, and definitely the cross-national surveys, missings would be more that to see how consistently countries are covered in each waves of the survey. Also in this dimension, we give a little bit more weight to the more recent data, as to show like that, whether more recently they've been improving. And then the timeliness is about the time between data collection and publication, and also generally how recent the data is. So we basically have a sort of a 3 scoring system in each of these different dimensions, in which for the 4th dimension, so the target type, that's not really a high, medium, or low score, but rather whether they distinguish between multiple migration types, where they focus on one specific migrant type, or whether it doesn't specify. And also regarding the timeliness, we also give a low score if the data is just generally a bit dated. So then I would like to, well, first a little bit before I go and show you the data inventory, we turned this list into a searchable website. On that website, as we'll show you, it also gives you the links to the data documentation and possibly also reports. And we also indicate accessibility. And another cool feature is that you can actually download your selected results. Let me show you. Okay, I hope you can all see the website. So this is the data inventory as it looks like now. So as you can see, the different columns represent all these different characteristics that I listed. So the name of the data set, data provider, data source, well, as you can see, first the data characteristics, then these migrant characteristics. We also really, if available, copy this definition of what a migrant is from the documentation. Then we give sort of more of a short version ourselves. Yeah, we show the different origin and destination countries. You can click more and then you can see the whole list. Whether it covers intra-EU migration, the years, the data has been collected, these demographic characteristics, and also how these groups are coded. Then the quality assessment. Here are 5 dimensions. Show the accessibility, and here we show the links to documentation, data set, and reports. So, and then the nice feature of this is that you can search yourself through this database, because it contains a list of about, well, over 140 different data sets. So it can be quite a challenge to search. So that's why we included these search options. So you can select, for instance, here on a data source type. What you can also select on is a group of countries. So for instance, you want to see migrants from other EU countries, then you can select EU, and then it selects all these EU countries for you. So you can type search. We have these first search options, but we also have an advanced search with even more options on what you can search on. For instance, say you want whether it has information on citizenship, and then you can click search, and then it will return the results that match your search. Right now it's an OR function. So for instance, if you select census and count, then it will select both data sets that use census and those that use count. So either or. So that's how the search function works. Another thing, because some people may still think that it's a lot of different characteristics that we show. If you think it's too many, you can hide certain columns to give more of an overview for yourself. And so there's a way to hide them, and here you can reset them again. And if you want to go back to the original list, you can clear search filters and then search again. Yeah, there's other options as well. I can recommend watching the instruction video for that. And also, if you want to know more about the data inventory itself, you can also check the documentation. Okay, I will go back to the presentation again. So then the future of this data inventory. Of course, it's a nice output for now, but and which we of course will continue to update during the QuantMig project. But we were thinking that actually this needs to continue also after the QuantMig project. And so we were thinking of, well, perhaps joining forces with other projects. For instance, we're talking with the Max Planck Institute, whether we can work together on their idea for the human migration database. But I think in general, we should think about institutes working together to make sure that this sort of data inventory continues to exist, and that we do not have to start from scratch again a couple of years later when we realize that we need this. Another thing, as you may have noticed, is that we do not include the data from national statistical offices, whereas often migration scholars do go to the national offices, because often they feel that they may get more detailed data there. I think in a sense, it would be better to move away from that, because it also undermines, I think, the efforts of these big data providers to actually give these cross-national data sets. Yeah, and also I think in terms of collaboration, and speaking of these big data providers, I think it would be very interesting if we could also collaborate here. And I think, for instance, when I was searching, I was interested if there would also be possibilities of combining these data tables and having links to that. So I think that could be interesting for the future as well. But anyways, I and my colleagues were very interested also to your thoughts in terms of the data inventory and where you would like to see it go. So be very interested to know your thoughts. In closing, I want to, of course, thank the whole team. As Mathias has been saying, it's been a collaborative effort within QuantMig, but we also had the help of the Southampton geodata team of Ian Waldock and Jason Sadler to really turn this list that we had into this nice searchable migration data inventory. So thank you all, and please check out the data inventory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jarl, for the presentation. We are going to move now to the panel debate, and I invite you to keep writing down your questions, and we'll go and we'll answer most of the questions as much as we can in our time slot after this conversation. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to three great colleagues working on migration data for many, many years. So this panel will start now, and you have Cris Beauchemin, who is senior researcher at INED, the French Institute for Demographic Studies. We have Nikola, who is the research director on migration and mobility at the German Federal Institute for Population Research. And we have Guido Tintori, who is policy analyst at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. So it's a great pleasure to have you. If you can unmute yourselves, or feel free to unmute yourselves. And we are going to have a very spontaneous conversation here. So please feel free to jump over after your colleagues and make this a nice conversation. So my first question to you is, when we look back, let's say 10 years ago on migration data, and we look what the state of affairs now, what do you consider are the greatest achievements so far? Who would like to start?
I can start. I think I have two ideas about that. One is thinking about the big bilateral migration databases that have been produced, for instance, by the UN or World Bank or OECD. Like 15 years ago, we didn't have that. And it became a huge tool that was hugely used for many, many analysis. So I think it's one of the big progress in the last decade. But still, I want to share some graph with you, because in the presentations we had before, you mentioned the issues of quality. And very recently, I started to compare the data that are in these bilateral databases for France, using the UN data and the World Bank data. And I found huge inconsistencies that I did not suspect. And I want to share you with this with you, and I'd be happy to have some ideas if you by yourself try to do some comparisons. So I'm going to share my screen to show you some results. Just excuse me. This one. You should see a graph. So these are immigrants. Can you see it? Yes. Yeah. So these are immigrants in France in 1990, and these are the most the most important groups in terms of numbers. And so you have one bar for each origin country. And the gray bar is are the numbers that you can compute using the census, the national census. And you can compare with the data that are available in the World Bank database, the orange points, and the blue points are the UN. And you can see that for some countries, the numbers are pretty similar if they are not exactly the same. But for other countries, you may have huge differences. For instance, here for Algeria or here for Portugal. So that's one thing I wanted to show you. Another thing, so it's only for 1990. And here I'm going to show you some graphs. So same thing, these are immigrant groups in France. And you have again the red curve is for the UN, blue is for the World Bank, and you have the different dates. So UN starts in 1990. And you can see that some numbers are hugely different. And that's true for Algeria again. But if you look at Argentina, again, you have some big gaps between the two sources. And if I'm going on, you're going to see that the curves that should be the same because the primary data sources are the same. And when measuring this is exactly the same thing, you have always big gaps. So thinking about quality, and there's another source that you mentioned that you can see in your tool, which is the OECD database that I did not use. But I think it might be very interesting to investigate further these differences. And at some point you mentioned the idea of combining data sources. And I think that using the three big bilateral databases, it might be good to combine them in one data set that could pick the most reliable numbers for each date and each country. So I think these big matrices are super important for us. Another, and maybe I'm going to keep my second point for later because I don't want to use all time for me. And I will have later some point maybe about surveys and survey inventories.
Thank you, Cris. Nikola, would you like to jump in?
Yes, I could probably add that I think we've actually come quite a way when it comes to migration data the last 10 years, but there's still lots of room for improvement. I've also seen these discrepancies in the global stock data that Cris mentioned. Might have to do with some estimations that the UN chucks in for what they call empty cells, I presume. But with regards to stock data, I think we've come some way also with official data sets. And I hope that the 2020 census will also give us some more opportunity also for data access now with the move for government open data, because that's also a problem that the National Statistical Offices often don't provide timely data to these agencies. Eurostat can probably talk more about that problem. I know that Germany has been not a forerunner in providing migration data to Eurostat. And when it comes to flow data, I think we haven't made that much progress in getting access to official statistics or harmonizing the way that we're collecting migration flow data. But we've come a long way when it comes to projects. QuantMig is one now, which is building on earlier work, such as the IMEM project from James Raymer, which made perhaps the first attempt at harmonizing the EU data flow data. There is, of course, various attempts now at providing estimation models for flows at the global level from stock data. So we have some idea at how many people actually move around the world each year, but only roughly and only depending on various model assumptions. So we can't really answer the presumably simpler question of how many people move between countries each year. And I think there's still a lot of room for improvement, but research projects are now really providing some really good progress here.
Hey, Guido, may I ask you what you consider to be the greater achievements in the last 10 years?
Yeah, yes, thank you. If I'd like to say that I really agree with what my colleague Nikola said just a second ago about the where the main improvement have been, and I would add to the conversation maybe another consideration, which is that more than in the past, let's say that there's been more actors at the table when discussion took place about how to improve data collection and how to operationalize the improvements in data collection. By that, I mean that it's not just, in the hands of the so-called receiving countries to set the conversation, but there's been an effort to involve also sending countries and taking into consideration how, to what extent, to a certain extent, how they define migration. But this goes to the fact, to what also my other two colleagues have already raised as a concern, as a problem, which is still there, which is a problem of definition. Because I don't think that we have witnessed yet a great improvement in the harmonization of the definition of the different categories by which statistics and bureaucratic apparatus define migrants across different countries. There's been, to some extent, in some regional aspects, in some regional context, an harmonization, but there's still room for greater improvement in that respect. And if I may just add one final thought, is exactly a question to the colleagues behind the otherwise excellent research project. That is, okay, I understand, the process. You start from this general request of having more data. So you basically take stock and make sense of all the data that are available, helping different users to navigate. But the problem is that these data needs change depending on the political priorities and the political discourses. And at the same time, also the definition change accordingly. And now, for example, the accent is very much on flows, on forecasting movement. But we have been working on migration for a while. And in the late 90s, early 2000s, in Europe, the accent was all about integration. So how do you think to keep pace also on how the definitions and the data needs are going to change and be flexible in the construction of your metadata tool in that respect? This is just an open question.
Thank you so much. You use your reply to ask you about definitions to the three of you. So when you look at the current state of affairs, and you look at definitions of migration and migrants, for example, based on country of birth, on nationality, the length of stay, are the definitions still meaningful for the data collection in the context of increasing diverse societies, or do you think we should think further about how we define migration and migrants?
Well, I could perhaps start. I think this distinction between stock and flow is still very valid, because they both, as Guido just pointed out, address very different questions. So if we talk about integration, about what's actually the stock of people in particularly receiving societies, but also from a diaspora perspective, perhaps what's actually diaspora population in countries or living abroad from the main sending countries. That's where the stock data really come in. And here we also have fewer, perhaps, discrepancies in the definitions. I mean, it's mainly relating to whether we use country of birth or citizenship. But other things that pertain to flow data are not really relevant in the stock data perspective. So we have more progress when it comes to harmonizing stock data than flow data globally. But flow data also have their valid point when it comes to tracing trends over time in the volume of people that are moving around. So I think we should not get off the hook of the national statistical offices with trying to collect migration flow data. The UN has quite for a long time now tried to lobby national statistical offices to harmonize the way they collect flow data. And one would wish them that they would have had more success in their efforts. But here is perhaps the most important point to set on that the time definitions are so different. So whether it's the year of the last move, whether it's the transitions from censuses, where did you live 5 years ago, where did you live 1 year ago, or the events data that are perhaps more important in the European context, from population registers where you count every migrant and not so much the migrations, but this might be a different topic that we might come back to in a moment.
I could comment also a bit about these definition issues, and I will come back on stocks. And thinking about stocks, when we think about the international standards, usually refer to foreign borns, and it's obviously very useful as a definition. But one of my concerns is that having this kind of standard definition, which is very pervasive, we miss the experience of international migration of nationals or people. And I have several examples in mind. In France, for instance, but this is not the only country here, who is a former colonial metropolis. If you consider people from Algeria, for instance, which is one of the major groups of immigrants in France, half of them were born French abroad. And if you look at their outcomes in France, thinking about integration outcomes, such like, I don't know, maybe unemployment rates, etc. If you look at all people born in Algeria, you will find that you will have a kind of average between those who were born French and the others. And missing this information about what citizenship at birth may lead to very confusing statistics in the end to show what is the situation of the immigrants. Another limitation, I think, of this foreign-born, very common definition, which is useful, but it's also that we miss the information on those people who experienced migration, especially return migrants for instance, in Europe, and in the context of growing circulation, at least before COVID. I think it's very important to recognize that when you think about the European viewpoint, thinking that European people born in Europe are also international migrants going somewhere and coming back is very important for the perception of international migration and how and the attitudes toward migrants, because there is a strong bias in Europe to consider that migrants are just migrants coming from southern countries to northern countries, from Africa to Europe, for instance, and we tend to miss other kind of movements. Another kind of population, I think, which is often overlooked, are the descendants of the migrants, and there are many countries in which we have no information on them. And still, this is very crucial for integration, both their children and sometimes also their great children. So I think that we need to go further than this definition of the foreign-born to have more information on those who are national, who are born as nationals.
If I may just very quickly add to, and answer directly to your question. My answer would be that, yes, I mean, these categories are still useful and are still, let's say it's the best that we have at hand at the moment. Of course, it can be improved. Of course, these categories need to be put in context, need to be dealt with awareness on how they work differently in different settings and how they interact with different layers, as Cris was exemplifying before. For example, I can add to what he was saying about the so-called second generation immigrants, which is nonsense, of course, because they are descendants of people who moved, who migrated. And they are born in the country. So if we adopt the country of birth criterion, they do not qualify as migrants. Nonetheless, in the society, they are considered migrants. And in some societies, as in many European countries, they don't have the citizenship of the place until they become of age. Or even later. And throughout all this period, which is a key for an individual path, so throughout the school cycle, etc., they are, by law, foreigners. So a more appropriate, let's say, way of defining them is second generation foreigners, as I wrote in an article that I published a couple of years ago. Because it's exactly describing more properly what they are, and what the law in that kind of system make them, even if they are statistically, by one criterion, not foreigner, but they are. So all these kind of complications, I think, also when we turn our attention not only on the flows, which is notoriously difficult to deal with, especially on a bilateral level, also on stocks, it is complex. And by the way, there's also one category which is very, very important in migration studies, which is, of course, what we define temporary migration or circular migration, which is a huge share of the component of international migration and labor migration. And this is, by definition, one of the most difficult to capture statistically. So on this, I think we need to make, of course, more progress.
Thank you so much. This is a very interesting discussion that we could keep talking for a couple of minutes more, but I would like to go to a final question so we can allow some questions from the audience. So what are in your perspective, the main research questions that still needs to be answered on international migration? And do we have data for that? So what are the questions for the future?
Big question. I think that for me it's a kind of obsession. I think something very important for now and also for the future is to consider that immigration is only part of international migration, and also I think something very important to take into account. Let's say the opposites of immigration. And when I say the opposites of immigration, I have two things in mind if we adopt the European viewpoint. One is to consider out-migration, and that's to what I mentioned before. I think it's very important to measure out-migration from national people, but also from immigrants or the children of immigrants, because in some countries it's very significant, and it says something about how the second generation feels in the countries where they were born. So out-migration is certainly something important. And when I say the opposites of immigration, I have also in mind non-migration, immobility. And seeing this, I have something even more specific in mind, which is family reunification. If you consider family reunification from the European point of view, there is this very pervasive idea that all migrants will reunify their family. And actually the information we have usually on family reunification is based on the official data on immigration. And actually, when you have information in surveys showing where the family members are, the children and the partners, you realize that a lot of migrants, a huge proportion of migrants, do not reunify with their children or with their partners. And so when I was saying it's important to also have a view on this, on non-migration, because it contributes to show that there is no invasion, which is basically the main story that we hear in public debates. So I think it's very important to have information on immigration and obviously to measure and have studies on immigration, but also I think it's also very important to think about out-migration because it says something about the receiving countries, and also thinking about those who could migrate but do not. Thank you.
I could perhaps add another point to this, if I may. I think from the perspective of knowledge economies and the intensifying global quest for talent, we should really lobby for better data on demographic characteristics of migrants and look beyond the pure numbers, perhaps disaggregated by age and sex, and look at education and labor force status. Because here we really have very little data that is cross-nationally comparable on who actually moves around the world, of what education level and labor force status. And yet this is very high and perhaps becoming even more important topic, especially in the EU context as well. And the second point I would like to make is with Jarl has touched on big data. And I'm sort of one of that researchers who more lobby for using National Statistical Office data and official statistics for the main questions on stocks and flows, but using social media and other big data in a more clever way to actually answer questions we cannot answer very well with the existing data, and not trying to re-estimate the numbers of people who move around the globe with social media data, where we have already a good idea from the data we have. But when it comes to temporary migration, for example, like Guido mentioned, we know very little from official data sources. And yet in the context of COVID, this might be the section or the type of mobility that might be hit hardest by the COVID crisis. Because we know now there is job mobility, there is fewer travel to conferences, to panel meetings, because more is happening online. And so temporal mobility might be affected much more by COVID in the coming years than perhaps permanent migration might be. So that would be a very interesting question to tackle with new data sources. But I would not let official national statistical offices off the hook to provide timely and accurate and reliable statistics on migration, and instead moving to big data sources. That for me would be at the current point too risky.
And very quickly, yes, adding to what Nikola was saying, I was thinking about, you know, the main question for the future. I would stick to this input, and I think that yes, we are, our societies are going in a direction where the holders of data about individuals are increasingly so private companies, more than it happened in the past, state bureaucracies. So to the point that these private companies actually know a whole amount of information more about individuals than the state bureaucracies. And this is actually something that we have started tapping into at the JRC with some work that has been done by colleagues using, for example, Facebook data to forecast the movement of, for example, Venezuelans in Spain, and we validated of course, the whole model, taking time against the official data from the Padrón Continuo, so the official statistics that are collected by local authorities in Spain. And this is the bridge to the second point that I would raise about the future, the question for the future, and if we are prepared in terms of data. Another thing that I've witnessed is more and more, let's say, involvement, increasingly so, involvement of local administrators in the discussions about migration, not only about integration, but also flows, because registered data are, of course, more timely, more accurate, and let's say, richer to what you can gather when there's all the passages of harmonization going through the national statistical offices and then to the European level. So this kind of involvement of local actors has definitely showed some potential to create some information, some knowledge community about data that is very promising, and it's helping addressing the questions that have been raised so far.
Thank you so much. I was looking at our Q&A, and thanks, Jarl, for answering to most of the questions writtenly. We'll put these questions and answers together when we release the video, so you can have access to them, which I think is a very rich material. There have been like more than 25 questions here, so we'll make a nice document so you can follow up on this discussions that has been that was happening online. But there's 2 comments that I would like to read here before we finalize, just for your reference, and if perhaps you can say something about it. And I apologize for the other colleagues who have asked questions. Just for the time limitations, we cannot cover all of them. So Jonathan Shaloff from OECD, he said that Guido Tintori rightfully points out distinction between temporary and permanent type migration is very important. Whether and how this will affect data collection. National classification systems don't necessarily correspond to behavior. OECD distinguishes, but this requires high-level coding. So it's quite challenging to do that, but it's very nice to know that OECD takes this into account. The other comment comes from Marcia Arango from GMDAC IOM, and she's asking about the UN Statistical Commission, and it's, what is it, the conceptual framework on international migration and mobility, if you would say some words about it, particularly about its implication for the relevance and harmonization of national and global migration statistics. So if you would like to share some thoughts about these 2 questions, and then we'll conclude our event. Thank you. Mathias, perhaps you can jump in and say some final words.
Maybe not specifically to these 2 questions, because I think we really have to look into the way these revisions that are have recently been discussed and put forward, I think may actually affect also the actual data collections. But maybe just one comment I would like to make on your last question, basically on, do we really have the data that we actually need? And I think one comment I would like to make on this point is really that we see that if policy makers, if the general public also has a key interest in certain types of information, and in particular when new policies are put forward and implemented and become more relevant, obviously, then data collection is also intensifying and it's more effort and resources put into that. So data collection follows policies in a way, and that's in some respect comforting, because the fact that policy making is expanding. There are now increasing number of instruments that are used to sort of manage migration in certain ways. At the same time, we see also increasing data collections going on. For instance, in the area of return migration, there are huge efforts also to get a better idea, better evidence base on return, including assisted return and voluntary return, etc. So there we see that there are efforts, even if it's not of high quality yet with regard to certain areas, but at least there's the effort. What concerns me more actually is the fact that we often ignore some areas of interest. And so collecting also policy irrelevant data, I think, is something we should really have to think about, and how we can also collect these data that is also, I think, extremely relevant for research.
Thank you so much. So thank you everyone who joined this event. I hope you enjoy this conversation, the presentation of our data inventory, and that you stay connected to the QuantMig project through Twitter, through our website, and our future events. Wishing you a great day and a great weekend. Thank you so much.